back to Faith Infused Leadership. I am your co-host Meredith Banka, and I'm here today with our host Debbie Heiser, who is also the founder of Three Vines Consulting. How are you, Debbie?
I'm fantastic, and I'm super excited today to talk about the topic we're going to talk about.
Yeah, me too. And it's not an easy one, I don't think, though. I think it's important. And you're really talking about, wanted to share with people that there can be loneliness in leadership. And how do we face that?
Yeah, and so Meredith, I think part of that is sharing a little bit about my story. And I mentioned in one of the first couple of podcasts that we did that I kind of grew up in corporate America in two different corporations, and each had different levels of this, but it's not always safe to share your emotions in an environment in an organization, whether that be a small organization or a domestic or international organization. And safety for that can look different ways. But part of that, it leads to, as I became a leader in my first formal leadership role, it was a little tough for me because I wasn't part of the gang anymore. I was part of a sales team, and then all of a sudden I'm managing a sales team, and some of the people I was on the sales team with that I used to go to happy hours with or go to lunch with, or, hear about what's happening in their sales or in their lives. I wasn't a part of that group anymore. And I wanted to be, and they wanted me to be, and we tried, but it just, there almost becomes this level of openness. And I guess what I mean by that is, we'd share all sorts of things with each other, but now that I'm the manager and I now have not only a responsibility to the business as far as my job, I have a responsibility of leading and managing these people. And if it's something that's impacting the business, there's almost a sense of responsibility that catches in the middle that, hey, I need to say something about what's happening with this person, but yet not wanting to break that confidence. And so there's almost a certain level of separation that occurs.
And how does that make you feel?
Yeah, it's lonely. It's hurtful in some cases. And in some cases, the logic part of you gets it, but your heart, so there's this tug of war between your brain and your heart. For me, that happened with it. And friendships did change some. And, there was a certain level of change with that. I remember, actually, when I was an executive at Citibank, I had a Bible study with a group of women. And one of the women that was a trainer in my organization was in my Bible study. And she was actually a good friend of mine before she became a trainer there. And so I had to set up some boundaries to say, we don't talk about work when we're here. And there are things that I'm privy to as an executive that I can't share with anybody on the team. And I can't share here at the Bible study. So I understand that I may not be able to go down that route. And I had to be okay with that. There are ways around it to a certain degree, but part of then the boundary was we don't talk about how we're in a Bible study at work. And it has nothing to do with me, but more so, I don't want other people feeling like you're being favored because you're in this other group with me that shares more personal, intimate information. So there is kind of that, and you want to be authentic and you want to be yourself, but there is a degree of separation that happens.
And isn't there also a degree of, you look to the left and there's nobody there. You look to the right and there's nobody there. And so you can begin to doubt your own decisions. Yeah. Because you can't share that information, because you can't go to the people that you went to before. And so again, you're back to feeling lonely.
Yeah. And I think there is this level too of guardedness that happens that sometimes may feel like a struggle with being authentic. But I also think it's about, because when you talk to your boss about some of those things, then they may see your people in a different light, and or depending on the leader or the manager, they may see that as not the kind of behavior that they want with, and so there's this fine, almost like this teeter-totter approach, right? That you have to kind of balance it and figure out what it's new rules to the game,
Mhm.
basically. So you're going to have to kind of figure that out. And it can be very confusing. And, to your point, when you look to the left and you look to the right, you may have peers, but each team is going to have a little bit different makeup. But I think that's part of the important piece, is understanding that you don't have to be alone, but it does feel very much like you're on an island by yourself. And that can create some disillusionment in yourself about, to your point, what decision did I make? I'm losing, my friendships are changing, and it's changing the dynamics between some of those people that I may have worked with for years. And so, and I think some of it's the approach. Like, as I took it, I still was very interested in their personal lives, but there would come a point in time when I'm like, if this is something that's going to impact the business, time out. Like, don't put me in that position where I feel like I have a legal or responsibility to go to HR with something. Like, we both need to understand that realm.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's that balance in that particular case too of, what sets the precedent in the relationship? Is it the personal relationship or the professional relationship? And how do you strike a balance in that? I think that definitely comes up, and that leads me to thinking, but it doesn't have to feel lonely, right? It doesn't have to be
No,
that way.
it doesn't. And Meredith, I have an example, and some people are going to disagree with the approach that I took. And I'm a firm believer in a statement that I heard about parenting by Oprah Winfrey, actually. And she was talking about her grandmother and how she was raised. And she said, my grandmother did the best she could with what she had. And if she knew better, she would have done better. And so I look at that and even think about that as leadership. And as an executive, and my husband and I both worked for the same company. We worked in completely different organizations, completely different buildings within the company. But as an executive, at that particular site, I knew the movement that was happening within his organization, and I knew he was losing his job 2 months before he did. So
Wow.
yeah, so that is what I'm talking about, even with loneliness. So I really had this dichotomy of tension, because I have this responsibility to the company. I have this responsibility, I felt like, to my husband and our livelihood of what was happening. But, and about 2 weeks before it happened, I finally said to him, I need to tell you this, here's what's happening. And, but I did make the decision to wait that long, and partially because I did the best I could with what I had. And there was, some degree of, this does need to stay under the hat. And I don't want to put him in a position where his peers are talking and then he feels like he can't be authentic and, has to lie or not say anything by omission. So there were a lot of things that went on in my head, and there's a lot of things that will go on in a leader's head on kind of where to kind of break those boundaries or move within those boundaries. But a lot of times there is information that you're privy to sometimes that will impact, and that's part of the loneliness, so there, for me, it was having a degree of separation. So I didn't put myself, because I'm not a good liar. I don't like to lie. I don't lie, but it's like, it's hard to put yourself in those situations where you say, I can't discuss that. It feels awkward, because then all the rumors start, because they don't know what you're talking. Oh, we can't discuss this.
Yeah, I think that's a good indicator too for someone who is maybe considering stepping into leadership, that you need to be willing to draw those lines and have those boundaries. And I've had the experience where someone was, potentially a great fit for a leadership position and declined it because they didn't want to step into that component of leadership. They didn't want to have to create those boundaries. They didn't want to have that loyalty to organization over relationships that were personal. They didn't want to go there. And I think that that's an important part of this, is that the loneliness is choice, and you can overcome that by employing some tools and doing some different things. So if you're working with this manager that's feeling this way, how do you help them? What do you say? What do you do? What do you suggest?
Yeah, so I think it depends on the situation as far as what I would say, but I think the most important thing is to validate the feelings. I've
Mm-hmm.
seen and been a part of too many times where people have invalidated my feelings about it. And those are very real feelings. And particularly if you were a part of that group and are now managing that group, that has a completely different dynamic than if you're new to an organization in a leadership position with an existing team.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I think part of it's being open enough to validate those feelings and help coach them through that and say, here are some tools that you can use. You need to think about what boundaries are, and you need to be able to have conversations with those people that are your friends. And it's okay to still have friends, but think about the positions that put you in. I will tell you, as a leader, when I've promoted people, I've tried my hardest to not have them lead people they were a part of a team.
Mm-hmm.
In some cases, you don't have a choice with that, as far as the placement of someone in a position. But I'm not going to hold somebody back that is qualified for the role and would be fantastic at it if that's the only lever there. um, I provide tools to people to say, you may have a peer group. If you're, as an example, I was an executive at the site and I was a vice president, and I had peers across the country that ran other sites, about 8 to 10 other people, depending on which season we were in. And so a lot of times being able to have relationships with 2 or 3 of those people that I knew and respected and trusted, I would contact them and say, I need to talk through a scenario, and, give me your take on this. And am I being sensitive to this? Am I, where am I at? And being able to process through some of those feelings with other people that had similar situations occur.
So having a peer group, even
Yeah.
if they're not necessarily at your same location, but
Yeah.
having that peer group that you can tap into.
Absolutely. And if you're an entrepreneur, you might say, well, who else can I tap into? There's a great website out there called meetup.com, and you can find other entrepreneurs that get together for networking, multiple different networking groups that you can become a part of and share some of those things that are happening if you want a more collaborative approach to things.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I know you and I've talked about even offline is that being a CEO is one of the few positions that doesn't have peers. And
Mm-hmm.
so there are ways to set that up, whether it's having a formal or informal mentorship program. There's been many times I've mentored leaders without them realizing it was a mentorship.
Mm-hmm.
I think sometimes when you formalize it, it becomes a little awkward in how you do it. I like to do it a little more organically.
Mm-hmm.
But then also setting up a board of directors. So if I'm a CEO or in the C-suite, or if I'm a frontline manager, finding 3 or 4 people that I respect and admire in business that also have different ways of approaching, so not the exact same way that I like to lead or manage. I like to have other people. I have someone I meet for breakfast now once a month still that is very analytical. And then I have another person that's very, what's your gut telling you? What's, spirit telling you? And I meet with them frequently to kind of talk through even business decisions as an entrepreneur that I'm making, and give me your perspective on this, and what am I missing, shoot holes in this. And I think it's important to then be able to have some of that collaboration outside of the organization, even to get a different perspective and to help you understand, because sometimes we can be in that scope and so in it that we don't see different perspectives about how we're feeling about it, and where our heart's coming into play with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that the faith component
Mm-hmm.
plays into this as well, right? If you really believe that you are placed in this leadership position for a reason, and that you've accepted the responsibility of what that means, whether that be, having information that you can't share, or, having to change the dynamic of some relationships, maintaining the faith that you are perfectly positioned to be serving people and the organization and the customer. I think that's a great cure to the loneliness, right? It's a great cure to the management blues to be grateful for that.
Absolutely. And Meredith, a couple of things come into mind, right? That at least in my belief system, I believe in the Trinity, that there's God, there's Christ, and there's the Holy Spirit. So if you think about that, God has manifested himself really in three ways to help people understand who he is and the characteristics of who he is, and they each have a different role in our lives. And so I think about that, even as far as, not saying that we're three different people, but having people around us to give us the different perspectives about things and to guide us. And I also think about, Jesus had 12 disciples. Now, a disciple is something a little different. They're learning from you, but you can't tell me that Jesus lived with them and traveled with them and didn't have some levels of conversation. I don't mean about a leader because he's leading that team, but then to your point, it's kind of understanding where they're coming from, but then taking time and making sure that I'm grounding in source. Like there's multiple times biblically where it shows Christ going and having these, intense moments with God and really grounding himself to say, your will, show me the next step. And I am a firm believer that faith to me is making the decision with God's direction, and he'll show you the next step. Like he helps drop in that decision, and then he's going to show you that next step, and just having faith that that's going to happen. So
if someone wanted to learn a little bit more about these concepts and the work that you do, where would they be able to find that information?
Yeah, go out to my website, www.3vconsulting, and that's all spelled out, and it's V as in Victor.com. And I would suggest, if you want to get into more conversation around the loneliness of a leader and what you can do to combat that, and kind of validate some of those feelings that you're having, to reach out and set up a consult with me, and let's talk through it.
Fantastic. Well, for this episode of Faith Infused Leadership, I'm your co-host, Meredith Banka, with our host, Debbie Heiser. We'll see you the next time.
Great. Everyone have a great week.